the perfect example of this is in this Outcast video, wherein these two women are kissing, and like in the same frame, you see Andre 3000 turn around and sort of give like an affirmative, like, yeah, it is this question of like how can space be made for Black sapphiness and for Black queerness within hip hop aesthetics, particularly because queerness is at play in how Black women navigate sexuality, but queerness by definition perhaps is not represented.
And I'll give one clarification. For the song Lick that was mentioned by Shinsia featuring Megan Thee Stallion, the Caribbean artist's name is Shinsia.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to have to come over here. I am going to talk about the embodied realm, and the lens that I'm coming from it is reclaiming the body, sensuality versus sexuality, and the difference between the Eurocentric perversion of Black women's bodies as sexual objects versus more African traditions of sensuality and using the body as forms of communication and worship. This particular section I'm calling Reclaiming the Erotic, Black Women's Bodies, African Dance, and the Politics of Representation in Visual Culture. In contemporary visual culture, Black women's bodies exist within a paradox, hypervisible yet misread, desired yet dehumanized, commodified yet disciplined. Under late-stage capitalism, Black women's sensuality is routinely collapsed into sexualization and flattened into consumable aesthetics that prioritize spectacle over subjectivity. This distortion is not arbitrary, but the product of a long genealogy rooted in colonial voyeurism, where Black embodiment has historically been framed through a Eurocentric white male cisgender gaze that marks it as excessive, deviant, and inherently erotic. Against this backdrop, reclaiming the distinction between sensuality and sexuality becomes a critical intervention. Sensuality in African and diasporic traditions is not synonymous with sexual availability. Rather, it is an embodied mode of knowing. Movement is a way of experiencing the self, community, and spirit through rhythm and presence. Sylvanus Kawor's analysis of Nlo-U dance traditions, particularly Agbadza, reveals that African dance is not a performance for external consumption, but a holistic system of communal knowledge production. Dance integrates movement, music, visual symbolism, and multi-sensory experience to communicate philosophy, ethics, and cosmology. Within this framework, the body is not an object to be consumed, but a vessel of sacred memory, spirituality, and communal identity. This distinction is crucial when interrogating how Black women's bodies are represented in popular media. Eurocentric frameworks often isolate specific movements, particularly those involving the hips, waist, and buttocks, and interpret them through sexualized lenses. However, as Kawar demonstrates in his article, these movements are embedded within a broader philosophical and pedagogical system. For example, the structured progression of Agbadza from preparation to climax symbolizes planning, growth, and justice, reflecting moral and social values rather than just erotic display. What is often read as provocative, quote, in Western context is African epistemologies, a language of balance, discipline, and communal accountability. Moreover, African dance practices foreground the spiritual and therapeutic dimensions of embodiment. The multi-sensory modalities described in Kawar's work highlight how movement engages internal feelings, spirituality, and kinesthetic awareness. linking the physical body to metaphysical realms. In this sense, dance operates as a site of trauma reduction, healing, and communication, offering a counter narrative to the capitalist frameworks that commodify Black women's bodies as simply sites of labor and pleasure for others. Rather than performing for a gaze, dancers engage in a dialogue within community, with their ancestors, and with themselves. The over-sexualization of Black women in pop culture, then, can be understood as a misinterpretation, one that strips African diasporic movement vocabularies of their culture and spiritual meanings. This misreading is further intensified by desirability politics, where colorism, sizeism, and featureism dictate which bodies are deemed marketable. In this economy, Black women's bodies are curated to fit narrow standards of hypersexual femininity, reinforcing stereotypes such as the aforementioned video vixen or the aforementioned city girl, while obscuring the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual labor embedded in their embodied artistic expressions. By returning to African-centered frameworks, we can resituate Black women's visual performances as sites of resistance and reimagination. Dance in this context, then, becomes a form of epistemic reclamation, a way of restoring the fullness of Black embodiment beyond the limits imposed by colonial and capitalist logics. It invites us to see the erotic not as something to be consumed, but as a sacred and relational force tied to joy, play, rhythm, and collective life and well-being. Conclusively, ultimately, this reframing challenges audiences to reconsider how they interpret Black women's bodies in motion. It calls from a shift from voyeurism to understanding, from a culture of consumption to one of respect, and from reduction to understanding complexity. In doing so, it affirms that Black women's sensuality, rooted in African diasporic traditions, is not a spectacle for capitalism, but a powerful expression of autonomy, spirituality, and cultural knowledge.